The morning Seattle skyline glistened like a silver blade under the pale light, sharp and silent. Ethan Walker stood unmoving from the 47th floor of a penthouse overlooking Elliott Bay, one hand pressed flat against the window. Beneath his palm, the glass was cold, but not more frigid than the emptiness blooming in his chest. To the world, he was the man who had it all, founder and CEO of Veritas Systems, one of America's fastest-growing healthcare technology companies. The man who wore tailored Italian suits with quiet authority, spoke in clipped precision at summits, and walked through corporate war rooms like a general who'd never lost a battle. If you Googled his name, you'd see it next to headlines like "The Visionary Behind AI-Powered Surgery" or "How Ethan Walker Changed Medicine." His face had graced tech magazines, investor blogs, and TEDx stages, but no headline ever told you that for all the power he held in boardrooms, he couldn't have a heartbeat steady, not his own. That morning, he didn't check his smartwatch. He didn't respond to the blinking blue of his two phones, stacked neatly on his walnut desk. He just stood there, silent, still. Something was off. It had started subtly, like a flutter in his chest weeks ago. A strange fatigue that coffee couldn't fix. At first, he blamed the jet lag: London, Dubai, San Diego in 10 days. Then stress. Then maybe too much caffeine. But deep down, he knew. Something inside him had shifted. Ethan Walker was a man trained not to flinch. His father, Charles Walker, a decorated Navy officer turned aerospace mogul, once told him, "Emotion is a liability, son. Strength is measured in silence." So Ethan grew up mastering silence. He knew how to speak without revealing, how to listen without reacting, how to win without connection. He built Veritas Systems from the floor of a one-bedroom apartment to a skyscraper that bore his initials on the top floor. He conquered markets, won battles no one thought he could, and negotiated billion-dollar deals with a calm smile. But in all that time, he never learned how to say, "I'm tired," or "I'm scared." And certainly not, "I'm alone." Behind the illusion of control was a man who hadn't eaten dinner with someone who genuinely cared in years. His last serious relationship ended with a post-it on the marble counter of this very kitchen: "I can't love someone who doesn't bleed." He didn't respond. He went to the gym. Then, I flew to a summit in Zurich. That was 2 years ago. Now, the coldness in his chest was not metaphorical. It was real. It crept like ice under his ribs as he walked into the marble bathroom, stripped off his shirt, and stepped into the rainfall shower. The water hit his skin like pins. He braced himself against the wall. Then the world tilted. His knees buckled. A bolt of pain shot across his chest, sharp and sudden, the kind of pain that made time feel like an elastic band stretching too far. He collapsed. Silence. No assistants, no private doctors, no security staff. Just a man who had spent his whole life running, now unable to crawl to his phone. Minutes passed, maybe seconds, an eternity. Then footsteps, keys, a pause, and then the door creaked open. "Mr. Walker?" A soft voice echoed from the hallway, light, unsure. She was supposed to come tomorrow. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays only. But something had told her to stop by this Saturday morning, a gut feeling. Layla Brooks, the woman who once took pride in alphabetizing his spice rack, who folded his clothes as if they were origami, who never spoke unless spoken to, but who always smiled when he wasn't looking. Layla stepped into the penthouse, saw the trail of steam, a shattered ceramic mug, a crumpled figure on the bathroom floor. Her world froze for half a breath. Then she dropped everything and ran. "Sir? Mr. Walker!" She knelt. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. CPR training flashed in her memory. A seminar she barely stayed awake through in nursing school. She never finished school. She pressed against his chest and began compressions, counting under her breath. When the emergency line answered, she didn't cry, didn't plead, just said clearly, "Middle-aged man, not breathing, no pulse. Penthouse 47B, 1715 Columbia Street. I'm performing CPR now." Then silence again. But not inside her. Inside her was chaos. She didn't know him. Not really. She knew how he liked his shirts hung white to dark, no starch. She knew he hated cinnamon. He always tossed the first cup of coffee if it wasn't hot enough. But she didn't know what his middle name was, or if he had a sister, or if he dreamed when he slept. She just knew that no one deserved to die alone on a cold bathroom floor, and that she couldn't let this be how his story ended. Sometimes, the people who change your life forever aren't the ones who make the loudest entrance. They're the ones who come back on a Saturday for no reason, walk into your silence, and bring you back to life without asking for a thing in return. Let us know if this story made you pause, even briefly. Like, comment, or follow for the next chapter. Love doesn't always arrive in grand declarations. Sometimes, it's hidden in the sound of someone knocking, when no one else remembered to check. See you in part 2. The sterile white of the hospital ceiling offered no answers, just a quiet, endless blankness, like the inside of a mind trying to remember how to feel. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, only to squint against the thin morning light bleeding through half-closed blinds. His mouth was dry. His chest ached with the dull weight of something unspoken. The rhythmic beeping of machines formed a pulse that wasn't his, but kept time as if waiting for him to return to it. He blinked once, then again. A cardigan came into focus, soft gray wool, stretched over slender arms, folded neatly in a lap. A woman sat beside him, half asleep, her head tilted ever so slightly against the back of the chair. She wasn't a nurse, not family. She didn't wear a badge or carry the confidence of hospital staff. It was her, Layla. Hair pulled back into a low knot. A medical magazine crumpled in her lap. Her fingers still carried traces of last night's tension, pressed nail marks on her palms. A slight tremble at rest. But her face was calm, as if she'd spent the last hours keeping something fragile from falling apart. He tried to speak, but only managed to croak. She stirred, then opened her eyes. "Mr. Walker," she breathed, and the name felt foreign to both for a moment. She stood quickly, glancing toward the hallway. "Don't move," the nurse said to call the moment you woke. He reached for her wrist, not with strength, but with the soft desperation of someone not yet ready to be left alone. You found me?" She nodded. "You didn't show up for your 9 a.m. meeting. I had a bad feeling. I stopped by to check in." Her voice faltered slightly. "You were on the bathroom floor." His chest tightened, not from pain this time, but from realization. "You called for help. I did more than that." Her gaze drifted downward. "You weren't breathing. I started CPR. I didn't know what else to do." His head sank deeper into the pillow. The ceiling above him remained quiet, unmoved by the gravity of what had happened. But he felt it in the soreness of his ribs, in the dull throb behind his eyes, in the unrelenting certainty that she'd saved his life. He whispered, "You saved me." Layla brushed a loose curl behind her ear and lowered her gaze. "I was just doing what anyone would." But they both knew that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't have come in on a day off. Most people wouldn't have pushed through panic and protocol and tried to pull a stranger back from the edge of silence. Most people would have waited for someone else to show up. She hadn't. Later that night, Ethan lay awake in the hospital bed, long after the nurse had dimmed the lights and whispered her final goodnight. He watched the IV drip measure time with quiet precision and thought about the hands that had pressed against his chest, how they'd fought for his heartbeat when he had not. He remembered her face, steady, focused, the kind of presence that didn't ask for space but earned it. His thoughts drifted to her voice, not what she said, but how she said it. The soft firmness, the way her vowels curled gently but landed with weight. It was a voice that knew how to wait, how to endure. And then he thought of the last time anyone had touched him with that kind of care, not calculation, not expectation, but instinct. It was as if, at that moment, she hadn't seen a CEO, an billionaire, or a man with a skyline beneath his feet. She saw a life, a fragile, flickering life, and she chose not to let it end. He slept for the first time in 3 days. The following morning brought with it a strange stillness, not the sterile stillness of the hospital, but a quiet inside him, a hush he hadn't known he needed. When Layla stepped in again with a thermos and a brown paper bag, he almost didn't recognize her. Her braid was looser. Her shoulders are less drawn. She placed the bag on the table beside his bed and looked at him without flinching. "You didn't eat dinner," she said softly. "I thought, maybe something familiar." Ethan blinked. "You're still here." She smiled faintly. "I promised the nurse I'd come back in the morning." He tried to sit up. Pain tugged at his chest. "Take it slow," she said, adjusting the pillows with the ease of someone who had done it before. Someone who cared not just about comfort, but dignity. "I'm not used to needing help," he admitted, voice hoarse. "I know," she replied, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "But right now, it's okay." She poured the tea into a disposable cup and handed it to him. Its aroma was lemony, soft, almost nostalgic. "Timo," she said. "My father used to make it when I was sick. Said it tasted like kindness." Ethan stared at the steam rising from the cup. "Thank you. It's just tea." But it wasn't. Not for a man who hadn't had a real conversation wrapped in strategy or stock evaluations in over a year. Not for someone whose daily nourishment came from protein bars and curated power lunches with people who never stayed past dessert. No, this wasn't just tea. It was warmth. It was ordinary. For someone like Ethan Walker, the ordinary has become a foreign luxury. Back home, days later, Ethan stood at the center of his penthouse like a guest in a stranger's house. Everything was where he'd left it, immaculate, automated, untouchably perfect. And yet, nothing felt familiar. The floors echoed too loudly. The bright lights dimmed too deliberately. The glass walls reflected a version of him that didn't quite fit anymore. He touched the edge of the couch, the same one where he'd once closed million-dollar deals while sipping espresso. Now it just felt empty. But at exactly 9 a.m., the front door opened. Layla entered. She didn't knock. She never did. The key had always been for convenience. But this time, she stepped in with something else, a quiet confidence, a sense of belonging that didn't come from title or tenure, but from having once held his life in her hands and refused to let it go. She didn't speak immediately, just walked to the kitchen, unpacked a soup container, and set a sticky note on the fridge. "Drink water. That's an order." And then she hummed. It was soft, old, a melody he couldn't place. Not something from a playlist or an ad. Something from a time before digital, before noise. Ethan leaned against the doorway, listening. That sound. Her voice. The steam rising from the pot. The scratch of her pen on the notepad sounded more like home than anything Alexa could replicate. Ethan Walker didn't feel alone in his house for the first time in years. He felt seen. He felt human. The days passed not with urgency, but with a quiet unfolding, as if something long dormant had finally begun to stir within the bones of Ethan's life. He wasn't used to this version of himself, lingering in the kitchen, ignoring the blinking red of unread messages, letting the world move without him for a while. It felt foreign, indulgent even, to wake and find that someone had already made tea, had already opened a window to let in fresh air, had thought to place a lemon wedge beside the cup, just because he once mentioned he liked the way citrus cut through morning breath. Layla moved through the penthouse without seeking attention. She didn't ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. She never hovered. Instead, she existed present but never pressing, like sunlight through sheer curtains. One afternoon, Ethan stepped into the kitchen and stopped mid-thought. Layla stood at the stove, a wooden spoon in one hand, her other tapping gently against the counter in time with a song only she seemed to hear. She was humming again, low and soft, a lullaby wrapped in memory. He leaned silently against the wall, listening. The melody wasn't precise. It slipped between notes and time signatures, meandering like something passed down rather than written. It carried the kind of tenderness that didn't demand to be understood, only felt. Layla turned, startled to see him standing there. "I didn't hear you come in." I didn't want to interrupt. She offered a small smile. "That song. My grandmother used to sing it to me. When I couldn't sleep. When I had nightmares." "It's beautiful," he said softly. "Familiar, somehow." "Maybe that's the point," she murmured, stirring again. "Some things don't belong to one person. They live in the air until someone else needs them." Ethan stepped further into the kitchen, sitting at the marble island. For the first time, he looked at her, not as the woman who folded his clothes or saved his life, but as someone with a history far older than his first impression, someone who carried stories in her voice, and grief in how she sometimes paused before finishing a sentence. "Tell me about her," he said, surprising himself. Layla's hands stilled. "My grandmother?" He nodded. She hesitated, then began. She was fierce, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. She believed in remedies you couldn't buy at pharmacies, garlic on windowsills, honey on burns, prayer whispered into boiling water. "Did you believe her?" "I believed she believed," Layla replied, her eyes distant. That was enough. Ethan didn't speak. He let the silence stretch between them, not as a void, but as a space. She glanced at him. "What about you? Did anyone teach you lullabies?" He exhaled a short breath that was almost a laugh. "No. My mother used to hum Beethoven, but not for me. For the wallpaper, I think." Layla tilted her head. "That sounds lonely." It was quiet. He reached for the glass of water she'd placed beside him, unnoticed. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. Layla stirred once more, then lowered the heat. "I know that kind of quiet." And somehow, that admission held more weight than any therapy session ever could.
Japanish.
Over the next few weeks, a rhythm emerged. Every morning, she brought warmth through breakfast, presents, and questions that never pushed too far. And Ethan, for the first time in years, responded. At first, in fragments. A half smile, a story from childhood, an old joke he hadn't used since college. Then, in complete sentences. He told her about the first time he got lost in a server room as a junior intern. About the night his father stood in the rain outside his graduation because he refused to sit beside Ethan's mother. About the time he spent 2 weeks in Bali and didn't speak to another soul for 8 days straight, and how he'd told himself that was healing, but now realized it was just a different kind of isolation. Layla listened. She didn't correct, didn't judge, just nodded, occasionally asking something no one else would have thought to ask. And when the time came, she shared too. "I was 22, she said one evening, their mugs of tea cooling on the coffee table between them. "In my 3rd semester of nursing school, I collapsed in the middle of clinical rounds." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "Why?" "They called it idiopathic, which means we don't know, but it's serious." She tucked her legs beneath her. "I was in the hospital for a month. Tests, biopsies, scans. I lost weight. My skin turned gray. It hurt to stand." "You never mentioned—" "I don't, usually." Her voice was quiet. "Because it changed everything. I had to drop out. My mom couldn't work. Bills stacked up. And when I got better, better meant alive. Not strong, not whole, just able to walk again." Ethan set down his mug. "I was told I might never carry a child," she said next, her eyes on the skyline beyond the window. "I cried for weeks. Then I stopped. I told myself I could still be a mother in other ways. Still love. Still serve." He didn't know what to say, so instead, he placed his hand over hers. "You're braver than I've ever been," he said. She looked at him. "I'm just doing what life asked of me. That's what bravery is." They sat there for a long time, wrapped not in conversation, but in a rare and gentle silence that didn't demand more. One night, after Layla had gone home, Ethan stood in front of the guest room. The door was ajar, the bed neatly made, and a faint trace of lavender was in the air. She has stayed there during the week, at his request. It had made sense at the time, easier for recovery, meals, easier for everything. But tonight, the room felt like something more, like a space someone belonged to. He didn't go in. He just stood there, listening to the hum of the building, the heartbeat of a life that no longer felt quite empty. And for the first time, he didn't fear the silence. He welcomed it. Because now, it wasn't hollow. It was full. Full of warmth. Full of breath. Full of something he hadn't dared name yet. But it was there. Growing. Softly. Quietly. Like a song he didn't know the words to, but recognized all the same. The rain arrived without warning. Seattle had its rhythm regarding weather unpredictable, disobedient, a quiet rebellion in the form of mist. That night, it poured, blanketing the glass walls of the penthouse in silver. The city below blurred into a watercolor of headlights and halos, glowing like memories that refused to stay sharp. Inside, Ethan stood barefoot in the kitchen, watching the reflection of Layla move as she reached up to return a bowl to the cupboard. Her simple cotton, pale blue dress brushed just above her knees. Her hair was still damp from the shower, twisted into a loose bun, a few strands curling rebelliously at her neck. They hadn't spoken much that evening, and yet everything felt loud. The quiet between them pulsed with something unnamed, not awkwardness, not discomfort, something else, tension wrapped in softness, like the pause before a first breath, or the stillness before a hand reaches out. Layla turned and caught him staring. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle, unassuming. He nodded, but the nod said too little. He wanted to tell her he hadn't felt this calm in years. He didn't know how to name the ache in his chest every time she walked past, humming some half-forgotten tune. He had begun anticipating the exact moment her footsteps padded softly down the hallway in the morning. He wanted to tell her that her presence had become a ritual he didn't remember ever inviting, but couldn't imagine being without. Instead, he asked, "Did you ever think about returning?" She tilted her head. "To school?" "To nursing. You said you left it because of your health, but do you ever still want it?" Her eyes moved to the floor for a moment, then lifted again. "Sometimes, but it's expensive. I'd have to stop working, and my brother's still in school, and there's my mom." A pause. "That part of my life. I think it passed." "It didn't." Her brows furrowed. Ethan leaned back against the counter. "You still carry it. I see it when you adjust the pillows under my back without being asked. The way you listen to breathing, not just words. That instinct doesn't go away." She smiled, but it was tight at the edges. "It's different when it's just a dream. It's safe there." "Maybe. But you deserve more than safe." Layla didn't respond. She reached for the tea kettle and poured hot water into 2 mugs. The scent of chamomile filled the room like a lullaby. As she handed him his cup, their fingers brushed a single second. But neither of them moved away. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was for the tea or something else entirely. She looked at him, then looked, and something shifted. The air felt thicker. The silence is more profound. "I should go finish the laundry," she whispered. "You don't have to." "I don't mind." "I do," he said. And this time, she paused. She slowly, cautiously set the mug down and turned to face him. The distance between them is now a fragile space filled with too many things unsaid. "Stay," he said, quieter now. Not a command. A plea. Layla didn't answer. Not with words. Instead, she stepped closer, just enough that he could see the tiny constellation of freckles at the curve of her collarbone. Her eyes searched his, steady, open. "Why?" she asked finally. Ethan didn't have a rehearsed answer. Nothing that would fit inside a sentence without spilling. So he took a breath, then another, and said the closest truth he could manage. "Because everything in this place feels quieter when you're gone, but not in a good way, in a way that reminds me of what I've been missing." Layla's lips parted, but no sound came. He reached for her hand, not abruptly, not dramatically enough to feel her skin against his palm, warm, steady, real. "I thought I understood what it meant to care about someone," he said softly. "But I didn't. Not really. Not until you." She blinked once, twice. "You've changed everything," he continued. "And you didn't ask for anything. You just gave. Quietly, without expectation." Layla looked down, trying to gather herself. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I only did what I knew how to do. And that was everything." He moved closer. She didn't step back. Their breaths synced, 2 people standing still in a world that had always demanded movement. And for once, neither of them tried to fill the silence. Then, softly, hesitantly, Ethan lifted his hand to her cheek. His thumb brushed a single curl behind her ear. Her eyes fluttered closed, not in fear, not in retreat, but in quiet permission. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But the space between them trembled with the gravity of what almost happened. She smiled when she opened her eyes again. But it wasn't polished. It wasn't practiced. It was trembling. unguarded, full of something with nowhere else to go but forward. "You're not alone in that," she said, and it felt like a promise. Later that night, long after Layla had returned to the guest room and the city outside had softened into midnight, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His fingers still tingled from the touch, not from electricity, not from heat, but from the feeling of being held without being trapped, of being known without being explained. He turned his head and looked toward the closed door down the hall. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was running from something. He felt like he was finally walking toward it. Sunday unfolded like a soft sigh, the kind of day that didn't ask for anything loud. No meetings, no calls, no urgent knocks at the door. Just rain lingering on the balcony rails, the distant hum of a ferry horn across Elliott Bay, and a warmth inside the penthouse that felt borrowed from somewhere much older than the city itself. Ethan stood in front of the stovetop, sleeves rolled halfway up, trying to remember what Layla had said about simmering instead of boiling. A pot of tomato soup. Her recipe bubbled unevenly under his nervous watch. He stirred too much, checked the heat too often. The spoon clanged against the edge of the pot as he stirred, not for flavor, but for distraction. Behind him, Layla moved across the kitchen like she belonged there, her presence subtle but grounding. She reached into a cupboard, pulled out bowls, then paused to tie her hair back with a silk ribbon, the color of deep plum. It caught the evening light and made her look almost like a painting, something timeless in motion. He glanced over his shoulder, and she caught him looking. "Relax," she said, her smile teasing. "You're not building a circuit board, it's just soup." "That's the problem," Ethan muttered, frowning at the bubbles. "Circuit boards come with instructions." Layla laughed, not politely, but in that rare, genuine way that bent her forward slightly and made the corners of her eyes crease. She reached for the ladle and took over without asking, adjusting the heat, tasting a drop on the inside of her wrist, adding a pinch of salt without measuring. "It's a feeling," she said. "You'll learn." He watched her for a moment, how effortlessly she moved in his space, and didn't try to control or rearrange it, just softened the edges. The kitchen, once all chrome and glass, had slowly begun to gather signs of her presence. A tin of cinnamon was tucked near the coffee grinder, a tea towel embroidered with sunflowers, a magnet on the fridge with a photo of her younger brother, grinning with missing front teeth. The change was so subtle it felt inevitable. Dinner wasn't formal. They sat at the kitchen island, side by side, bowls steaming between them, bread still warm from the oven. No candlelight, no playlist, just the quiet tap of spoons and the occasional sigh of contentment. "This is good," Ethan said, surprised. Layla gave him a proud look. "You did most of the work." "Liar." "I adjusted the flame." "That's it." He chuckled and added salt. "Exactly. A crucial intervention." They fell into easy conversation about nothing and everything. A memory from Layla's childhood involving a stubborn rooster. Ethan's disastrous attempt at making pancakes for his niece 10 years ago. He locked himself out of the office barefoot because of a fire drill. It was light, silly, and strangely essential. But the air shifted when the dishes were done and the tea brewed. They moved to the living room without discussion. Ethan brought the mugs. Layla wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. The space between them on the couch wasn't vast, but it pulsed with a quiet awareness, the kind that came from not needing to speak. Outside, the rain started again, this time softer, more deliberate, like a lullaby for the city. Ethan turned slightly toward her. "Do you ever think about what your life might have been like if things had gone differently?" Layla looked at him, thoughtful. "Sometimes, but not in the way people mean." "How so?" I don't imagine a mansion, degree, or perfect job. I wonder what it would have felt like to breathe easier, to not carry everything alone. He nodded slowly. I get that. She tilted her head. What about you? I used to think about that a lot, he admitted. What if I hadn't been so cold, so afraid of letting people in? There was a woman once, Karina. She stayed for 3 years. Being with me felt like reading a beautiful novel where the pages were glued shut. Layla didn't speak. I just listened as she always did, with presence, not pity. I used to think she was wrong, Ethan continued. Now I think she was right. I just wasn't ready to be read. Silence fell again, but it wasn't heavy. It was full. Layla shifted slightly, pulling the blanket over her legs, her shoulder brushing lightly against his arm. The contact was unintentional, but neither of them moved. You're not glued shut anymore, she said quietly. Ethan turned his head. No. You creak open now, she whispered, like an old book someone finally picked up again. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Minutes passed. Then slowly, she leaned against him, not out of weakness or weariness, but something gentler. A choice. He stiffened for half a second, then relaxed, letting his arm fall behind her without thought. Her head rested just beneath his collarbone. He could feel her breathing, could feel himself breathing. Together. Not in sync yet, but close. I'm scared, he said, almost inaudible. Of what? That I'm going to ruin this. Layla didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for his hand beneath the blanket and laced their fingers together. You don't have to know how to do it all, she said. You just have to stay. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, they sat without speaking for a long time, hearts slowly adjusting to the weight of being seen. There was no kiss, no grand confession, just warmth, just stillness, and the quiet miracle of two people sharing the same silence for the first time, without either needing to fill it. Monday came with a faded sun and a city still wrapped in the scent of rain. Seattle's streets glittered with leftover puddles, and from the 47th floor, the skyline looked as if it had exhaled something heavy overnight. Inside the penthouse, everything remained still, except for the shift in the air that neither Ethan nor Layla acknowledged aloud. Something had changed, not loudly, not instantly, but undeniably. Ethan woke before his alarm. He hadn't done that in years, not since the early days of building Veritas, when hunger was the engine and sleep a negotiable detail. But this morning, his eyes opened with a quiet steadiness, not because of pressure, not because of strategy, but because he knew she was already awake somewhere in the kitchen, barefoot, humming without knowing she was humming. He sat up slowly, pressed his feet to the cool floor, and exhaled. For once, there were no meetings he couldn't miss, no inbox demanding his blood. A soft gravity pulls him toward the scent of cinnamon and something sweet, like honey warming in a pan. Layla stood by the window when he entered the kitchen, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. The morning light stretched across her face, catching the curve of her cheek and the quiet determination in her eyes. You're up early, she said without turning. So are you. She looked over her shoulder. Some habits are hard to shake. He walked closer, reaching for the second mug she'd already placed on the counter for him. Her quiet predictability made his chest ache most gently. Smells like toast. And orange peel tea. You looked tired last night. I didn't sleep much. I know. She didn't ask why, and he didn't explain. The silence that followed didn't strain. It settled, comfortable like a sweater you keep reaching for without thinking. As they stood side by side, the city began to stir below. Lights flickered on in distant windows. A ferry drifted across the water. Somewhere, the world was spinning, rushing, negotiating itself into another workday. But inside, Ethan felt no urgency to catch up. He glanced at Layla. "Have you ever been to the water garden in Fremont?" She raised an eyebrow. "No. Why?" "Let's go." Her laugh was surprised. "Now?" He nodded. "Why not?" Layla looked down at her oversized sweatshirt and leggings. "I'm not dressed for public admiration. You're dressed like someone who deserves a breath of air. That's more than enough." She considered him for a moment, searching, maybe, for some hidden motivation. But there wasn't one. Just a man who had grown tired of being buried beneath plans, now craving something spontaneous, unpolished, and authentic. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's go." The garden was nearly empty, tucked behind a line of industrial buildings that gave no hint of the serenity inside. Gravel paths wound between still ponds, mossy stones, and benches shaped like river stones. The air smelled of wet cedar and iron-rich earth. It wasn't grand. It wasn't curated for photos. It was honest. Layla strolled, arms folded, eyes scanning the water lilies that bloomed in tight clusters. Ethan followed respectfully, hands in pockets, watching her more than the scenery. "They don't open until noon," she said, gesturing to the lilies. "I didn't know that. They need the light, more than most flowers." He looked at her. "And you? What do you need?" She paused, then turned to him. Her expression was unreadable calm, but layered. "I used to think I needed a lot of things. A title, a paycheck that didn't vanish by week's end, a room of my own." She looked away. "Then I lost most of that. And I learned I only needed one thing." "What?" "Space to breathe." Ethan nodded. "And now?" She smiled faintly. "Now I just want to keep choosing things that let me exhale." They sat on a bench near the water, watching the koi slide lazily through reflections. A breeze rustled through the pines. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan said, "I've been thinking about the nursing school." Layla didn't move. "I looked up the program," he continued. "It's still accredited, still accepts part-time enrollment. There's even a scholarship program, one that my company happens to fund." She turned to him slowly. "Ethan, I'm not offering you a favor," he said gently. "I'm offering you a door. Whether you walk through it is up to you. But I'd like to hold it open." Her eyes shimmered, but she blinked them away. "You're not responsible for my dreams." "I'm not trying to be," he said. "But you saved my life. And in doing that, you reminded me that a life isn't worth much unless you use it to build something better for yourself and someone else." Layla looked at her hands. "I didn't think anyone would ever say that to me," she admitted. "Not like this. I mean every word." Silence fell again, but this time it felt like a bridge. When they stood to leave, Ethan didn't reach for her hand. He didn't need to. She walked beside him, and that was enough. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Olympic Mountains, casting golden shadows across the living room, Ethan sat alone with his laptop open, rereading an email he'd drafted earlier. Subject line, Veritas Wellness Initiative, proposal draft. He'd written it after the hospital stay, after the CPR, before the soup and the humming and the silence that changed him. It outlined a new program for employee care, mental health support, paid parental leave, and accessible resources for lower-income staff. He'd meant to send it weeks ago. But something had always stopped him. Until now. He clicked send. Then stood and walked toward the guest room. The door was ajar. Layla sat at the edge of the bed, a book in her lap, glasses slipping slightly down her nose. She looked up as he entered. "Did I interrupt?" "No," she said, closing the book softly. "Just finished the chapter." Ethan hesitated at the doorway. Then, quietly, "Can I sit?" She nodded. He sat beside her, careful not to touch. "I sent the proposal tonight." Layla smiled. "The one you told me about?" He nodded. "I'm proud of you," she said. He looked at her, his voice low. "I'm thinking maybe I needed to be broken open, just a little, to realize what was missing." Layla didn't respond. She reached across the space between them and rested her hand over his. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not a grand one, but in its simplicity, it carried the weight of something honest, something whole. And somewhere inside him, Ethan understood. He wasn't at the end of something. He was standing at the edge of the beginning. It began with a letter. Not the kind typed on a sleek corporate letterhead or signed with digital precision. This was different plain paper, soft at the edges, written in Layla's looping, almost musical handwriting. One morning, Ethan found it tucked under his coffee mug, just before the sun broke entirely over the sound. He hadn't heard her leave the guest room, but she had been there early, as always, quiet as the light she let in when she opened the curtains. The note was short. "Don't forget your vitamins, and drink water. You're not invincible. L." No flourish, no pretense. Just care. Folded carefully into 6 words and a signature. Ethan held the paper longer than he meant to. He reread it and traced the curve of her L. For a moment, he didn't feel like a man recovering from a cardiac event or a CEO known for bulletproof decisions. He felt like someone remembered, noticed, and chosen in the small, invisible ways that mattered most. He slid the letter into the drawer beside his bed. Later, he would tuck it into a book. And long after that, he would still remember exactly how it felt to read it. The days took on a new rhythm. Layla didn't move out of the guest room, but the boundary between theirs and hers grew soft at the edges. She no longer knocked before entering the living room. She hummed while folding laundry. She kept a second toothbrush in the guest bath and a hair clip on the nightstand beside his. One evening, she stood beside him in the grocery aisle, holding 2 cartons of oat milk. "This one has less sugar, but this one's organic. Which do you prefer?" he asked. "I grew up on powdered milk," she replied. "This feels fancy, no matter which one we pick." He laughed and took both. When they got home, she placed one in his fridge and one in hers, still living between 2 spaces, but one foot steadily moving closer to his. That weekend, they visited her mother. The house in Tacoma was modest, tucked at the end of a quiet street lined with tired trees. The grass had grown patchy, the screen door creaked, and the paint began peeling. But Layla moved through it with reverence, touching each surface as though it still pulsed with childhood echoes. Her mother, Mrs. Denise Brooks, greeted them in a yellow robe and house slippers at the door. Her hair was wrapped in a silk scarf, her expression unreadable. "So this is him," she said without smiling. Layla stepped in quickly. "Mama." But Ethan cut in gently. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Ethan." Mrs. Brooks studied him with a gaze that had likely reduced entire childhood lies to ash. You made my daughter work weekends with no paid overtime? Ethan blinked, surprised. Then slowly he smiled. That was me. She nodded once. Good. Then you'll understand why I ask what your intentions are. Mama, stop, Layla murmured, visibly mortified. But Ethan didn't retreat. He folded his hands and said, I intend to listen more than speak, to make space for her dreams, not stand in their way, and to show up every day, not just when it's easy. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Brooks looked at her daughter. Make him cook, she said. If he survives your collard greens test, he might be worth the trouble. Layla rolled her eyes. She says that to everyone. I do not, her mother muttered, turning away. Just the ones I don't trust yet. But Ethan noticed the slight lift in her voice, the way she refilled his teacup without asking. And when they left 2 hours later, she pressed a bag of sweet potatoes into his hands. For strength, she said gruffly. He didn't miss the way Layla smiled back at the city. One night, near the end of that month, Ethan invited her to a gallery showing. It wasn't a big event, just a collection of local artists sponsored by one of Veritas's smaller philanthropic branches. But it felt different, important. I don't have anything to wear, Layla said when he brought it up. You have that navy dress, he replied. It's too simple. It's perfect. She hesitated. People will stare. Let them. So she wore it. Her navy dress, soft and straightforward, hugged her in all the ways that made her seem less like a guest and more like a vision. She wore her hair in a loose updo, a silver chain at her neck, and no makeup beyond a faint shimmer on her eyelids. When Ethan saw her step out of the guest room, he stopped breathing for half a beat. You look. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. She smiled, but her eyes were questioning. I don't want to embarrass you, she said quietly. Ethan stepped closer. Layla, he said, her name spoken fully, firmly, as if he were trying it out in a deeper register. You are the most extraordinary person I've ever known. You couldn't embarrass me if you tried. And something in her shifted, relaxed, opened. They drove in silence, her hand resting lightly on the center console, not quite touching his. But when he reached for it, she didn't pull away. At the gallery, people noticed. Of course they did. Some whispered, some smiled, some looked confused. But Ethan didn't care. He introduced her not as my housekeeper, or my assistant, or even my guest. He said, This is Layla Brooks. She means everything to me. And when the words left his mouth, it felt like something in the room aligned, like the truth had rung out clear and undeniable. She didn't look at him then. She didn't have to. Her hand tightened around his. And when they returned home, quiet and full of the weight of being seen, Layla turned to him at the elevator and said softly, I never thought I'd hear my name like that, like it belonged in a sentence that sounded like home. Ethan leaned forward, pressing his lips to her forehead. It does. And in that moment, it wasn't a name anymore. It was a promise. It had been 2 weeks since the gallery showing, but Ethan could still remember exactly how her name sounded in that room, spoken aloud. No title attached. No need to explain. Just Layla. He hadn't rehearsed it or crafted the moment in his head as he once would have with any public appearance. It had come naturally like breath, and ever since, something between them had deepened, not with dramatic declarations or sudden change, but in quieter, more permanent ways. Her coffee mug now lived beside his on the drying rack. Her scarf was looped casually over the arm of the living room chair. Her laughter echoed more freely through the hallways, as if the walls had finally learned to carry joy. And then came the Thursday evening he would never forget. The city had wrapped itself in that cold gray fog Seattle was famous for. The penthouse windows looked out into clouds that seemed close enough to touch. Ethan had stayed home from work, citing a fabricated strategy review meeting truthfully. He just wanted to make dinner. Please do not order it. Do not delegate it. Make it. He was still clumsy in the kitchen, too heavy-handed with salt, impatient with simmering, suspicious of anything that required folding dough. But Layla had taught him how to listen to a pot, how to trust his hands. He was slicing basil when she stepped in, keys still in hand, cheeks tinged pink from the cold. Smells like garlic and maybe regret, she teased, setting her purse down. He looked up, smirking. Don't get too cocky. I watched 3 YouTube videos for this one. I'm honored. She crossed the kitchen, glanced into the pot, and gave a slight nod of approval. At least it's not on fire. Progress, he said, offering her a spoon. Taste it. She obliged, letting the broth linger on her tongue. Her eyes widened. Oh, okay, this is... She turned to him, surprised. Good. I accept your apology in advance. She laughed, pulling her hair back into a loose bun. He watched her move how effortlessly she belonged here now. And suddenly, it struck him that her presence no longer felt like a pleasant intrusion. It felt like the point. After dinner, they sat on the living room floor, backs against the couch, a blanket draped over their legs, a record spinning something slow and unfamiliar. Layla leaned her head back, eyes half closed. You ever wonder how we got here? All the time. Like, what was the exact moment? She asked. The tipping point? He thought momentarily, then said, You walked in on your day off because something felt off. Intuition, she said with a smile. Fate, he corrected. She opened her eyes, looking at him. You believe in that? I didn't, he admitted, but I do now. Silence stretched between them. The music played on, vinyl crackling like soft static beneath the melody. Then, out of nowhere, Layla said, Do you think about children? Ethan blinked. Children? Yeah. He turned toward her. That's unexpected. She didn't look embarrassed, only thoughtful. It's not a proposal, just a question. He considered it for a long moment. I used to say no. I was too focused, too busy. Those kids would change everything. And now? Now. He looked down at his hands. Now I think they'd change all the right things. Layla didn't speak immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. I was told once that I might not be able to carry a child. The words sat heavy in the air. I was sick, she continued. Years ago. Doctors weren't sure what it was. My body recovered, but something inside me shifted. They said it would be difficult, maybe impossible. Ethan turned fully to her, his voice soft. Why didn't you tell me before? She shrugged. Because I was afraid you'd look at me differently, that it would become a factor, that everything would change. He reached for her hand, covering it with his own. Layla, I didn't fall for you because of what you might give me. I love you for everything you already are. She exhaled, a trembling breath. You said love. I did. It was the first time, and it didn't feel like a leap. It felt like arriving. Her lips parted, but no words came. So she leaned forward instead, pressing her forehead to his. They stayed like that, touching but not rushing. The room hushed except for the record spinning toward its end. Later that night, long after they had gone to bed, Ethan awoke to find Layla sitting at the edge of their bed, her profile bathed in moonlight. "You okay?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. She turned slowly. "I've just been feeling off." "How off?" "Tired, dizzy, strange." He sat up, fully alert now. "Do you want me to call someone?" She shook her head. "I think I just need to rest." But something in her voice gave him pause. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. Layla hesitated, then rose and crossed the room. She opened the bottom drawer of her dresser and pulled out a small box. Inside was a pregnancy test. Ethan sat very still. "I bought it months ago," she said, voice barely audible. "You threw it into the basket during a grocery run," said, "just in case." We laughed. He remembered. He remembered the exact shade of pink the box was, the way she rolled her eyes, but didn't put it back. Layla looked down at the test in her hand. "I don't know why I kept it." He stood slowly, walking toward her, maybe because some part of you believed. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped into the bathroom. Ethan waited, hands clenched, breathed shallow. Time felt like it stopped blinking. When she stepped back out, she held the test in both hands, staring at the tiny screen. She didn't speak, didn't move, just looked at him with wide, glassy eyes. "It's positive." The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff where the air was thin and full of stars. Ethan stepped forward. "Are you sure?" "I took 2 more." He stared at her, then slowly dropped to his knees. He pressed his hands to her waist, his cheek to her stomach, and closed his eyes. "We're having a baby," he whispered. She touched his head. Her hands trembled. "So it seems." And in that moment, with her standing above him and the night wrapping around them like a held breath, Ethan felt something shift permanently in his chest. Something sacred. Something like forever. Morning came too fast. The sun broke lazily across the horizon, but the light didn't reach the quiet inside Ethan's chest. He had barely slept, not from anxiety, but from the impossibility of stillness, when everything in his world had just tilted on its axis. One small, quiet word echoed through his mind, like a secret passed from the stars. Positive. It wasn't just the test. It wasn't even just the idea of fatherhood. It was her, standing barefoot in their bathroom, holding the evidence of a future neither dared imagine. It had made something in him both unravel and fall perfectly into place. Layla slept in fragments light and curled against his side, her fingers resting protectively near her belly, as if her body already knew what it was doing. He watched her, unable to stop, the moment's weight still blooming through him in waves. When she finally stirred, eyes fluttering open to meet his, there was a quiet understanding in her gaze. "So," she whispered. "So." Neither of them smiled at first. The emotion ran too deep. But then it came, faint, slow, stretching across her face like sunrise. Ethan leaned in, brushed her hair back, and kissed her forehead. "Let's find out what's next." The doctor's office was painted in calming hues, soft blues and muted creams, like it had been built to examine and reassure. Layla sat on the exam table, a paper gown draped over her knees. Ethan sat beside her, one hand wrapped around hers, the other clenched too tightly in his lap. Neither of them spoke much on the drive there, not out of fear, but out of reverence. The nurse had smiled gently when she entered. "You're here for a confirmation?" Layla nodded, voice too soft to carry. "We'll look. See how far along you are." Her tone was warm but clinical, like she had said those exact words 1,000 times. Ethan only heard two. See? Look. As if reality still needed proof. Then came the cool gel, the wand, the silence, and then the sound. At first, it was just a faint thump, steady and low. Ethan blinked. Then another, slightly higher, quicker. The nurse's brow lifted. "Well," she murmured, turning the screen gently toward them. "I have something to show you." Layla leaned forward slightly. "There's not just one heartbeat," the nurse said softly. "There are three." The room fell into a deep hush that seemed to steal the air. Ethan stared at the screen. 3 flickers, 3 pulses. Not side by side, but somehow in rhythm, like the beginnings of a symphony, only they could hear. "Triplets?" Layla breathed. The nurse smiled. "Triplets. All strong, all measuring right on schedule." Ethan dropped back into the chair, as if gravity had pulled the truth through his chest. He covered his mouth with both hands, eyes wide, stunned into stillness. Layla was crying. Not loud sobs, just the quiet, trembling kind that didn't ask permission. She looked at him through blurred lashes. "We're having 3 children." He nodded, voice cracking open. "We are." She reached for him unquestioningly, and they clung like anchors when their hands found each other. Back at the penthouse, everything looked too small. Once vast and minimalist, the kitchen now felt incapable of housing 3 high chairs. The bedroom, barely big enough for 2, would soon echo with unfamiliar cries and impossibly small breathing. Ethan walked from room to room in a daze, trying to imagine it. 3 cribs, 3 names, 3 lives waiting to unfold. He stopped in front of the window. Seattle's skyline blinked back at him, unaware. Cars rushed. Buildings stood indifferent. But inside this space, his entire world had changed. Layla stepped behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. He leaned back into her gently. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I've been handed something sacred and slightly terrifying." She smiled against his back. "Me too." They stood that way for a long time, her hands pressed just below his ribs, his breath steadying with each quiet beat of her presence. Later, they sat on the floor with notebooks, sketching name ideas. Ethan wanted something substantial. Layla wanted something meaningful. They disagreed for an hour, laughed through it, then settled into a silence that felt deeper than discussion. "I've never let myself imagine this," Ethan admitted. "Not even once." "Me neither." "Why?" She folded her hands in her lap. "Because dreaming hurts more than silence when it doesn't come true." He looked at her. "Then let's build it. Not just dream it." She nodded, eyes glassy. "One day at a time." The following weeks passed in layers. Doctor's appointments, nutrition plans, baby books. Ethan, who once scoffed at dad blogs, now bookmarks articles titled "Triplet Parenting: What You Need to Know." He assembled a rocking chair. It took 3 hours. Layla pretended not to laugh when he installed one leg backward and didn't notice until he tried to sit. He painted the nursery walls with the careful focus once reserved for boardroom strategy charts. Layla chose a palette of sage green and ivory, soft enough to soothe, warm enough to hold. She started humming again, sometimes to herself, sometimes to her belly, and sometimes in the middle of the night, when she couldn't sleep, Han would find her barefoot in the nursery, arms cradling a belly that still didn't quite look like it held 3. "I don't feel ready," she confessed once. eyes searching his. He knelt in front of her, hands on her hips. Neither do I, but we don't have to be. We have to show up. And if we make mistakes, we will. She smiled faintly. That wasn't very reassuring. But we'll learn, he added, together. She bent slightly and touched her forehead to his. That part sounds better. One night, after the lights had been turned off and the house had gone still, Ethan lay awake, one hand resting on Layla's belly. It was rising and falling softly, her breathing even, her warmth steady beside him. He whispered, "You're so small, and they're going to need so much." Layla didn't stir, but her hand slid across his chest in her sleep, as if answering him without sound. 3 heartbeats, 1 life, and a love they were still learning to carry, but already knew how to protect. And Ethan, who once built an empire on silence and control, finally understood what it meant to surrender to something greater than himself. Something loud, something messy, something terrifying, and beautiful. By the time September folded into October, the golden light of autumn softened everything it touched. The air outside grew thinner, brisker. The leaves in Volunteer Park began their annual descent, floating from branches like slow confessions. Inside the penthouse, the season settled into every corner. Soft throw blankets reappeared. The windows stayed closed just a little longer in the mornings, and the kettle on the stove began to whistle more often than the phones on the counter. Layla was now well into her 2nd trimester. Her body was changing in ways neither of them could keep up with. Her gait had shifted. Her appetite, once predictable, now followed its whims. Thankfully, the nausea had faded, but a new fatigue had occurred. It wasn't the kind that sleep could fix. It was deeper, like her body was using every quiet moment to make space for 3 small sacred lives. Ethan became more attentive than ever. At first, subtly, she adjusted her pillows, remembered her supplements, and held her elbow when the elevator jostled too sharply. But as the weeks progressed, his care grew more deliberate. He stopped staying late at the office. He installed a bench in the shower and memorized the sound of her breathing at night so he'd know if it had changed. She never asked. He just did. And Layla, who had spent most of her adult life taking care of others, now found herself being taken care of in a way that felt both unfamiliar and terrifyingly tender. One afternoon, while folding baby clothes in the nursery, onesies still tagged and smelling faintly of lavender from the boutique paper, they talked about names again. "What if one of them hates theirs?" she asked, holding up a tiny jumper embroidered across the chest with silver stars. "Then we'll tell them we picked it with love, and we're open to negotiation," Ethan replied, smirking as he arranged diapers in a drawer with near-surgical precision. Layla paused. "You've never done this before?" He looked up. "What? Labeling diaper sizes?" "No," she said, her voice soft. "This." He straightened, met her gaze. "No." And she smiled, not because she didn't believe him, but because she did. That night, something shifted. It was small at first. Layla didn't finish her dinner. She stirred the roasted squash with her fork, took 2 bites of the couscous, then set her plate aside with a distracted hum. "You okay?" Ethan asked. "Yeah. Just full." He didn't press. Later, while watching a documentary on the couch, she grew restless, tugging at the hem of her sweater, shifting positions every few minutes, glancing at her phone though there were no messages. Ethan muted the television. "What's going on?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know." "Is it the babies?" "No," she said quickly, then paused, I mean, maybe. I feel off. Her hands went to her stomach as if seeking confirmation from within. He turned to her, his voice calm but steady. We can call the doctor. Layla shook her head. No, it's not pain. It's just, I don't know how to explain it. Like I'm too full of something that doesn't have a name yet. Ethan didn't push. Instead, he reached for the blanket, spread it over her legs, and then shifted closer. So close, she could feel his warmth being touched. Then let's just sit with it, he said. So they did. The television stayed muted. The lights remained low. The clock ticked somewhere behind them. And neither of them said another word. At 3:17 a.m., Layla woke with a start. Her breath caught before she understood why. The room was dark. Still, Ethan's hand rested lightly over her hip, warm and protective. But something in her chest buzzed with disquiet. She sat up slowly, one palm on her belly, the other pressed flat against the mattress. She felt still, too still. No flutter, no shift, no subtle push of tiny feet testing space. She held her breath, waited. Nothing. She whispered, Ethan. He stirred immediately, eyes adjusting. What is it? She turned to him, her voice small. They're not moving. He sat up. What do you mean? I usually feel them around now, but tonight, nothing. Ethan was already reaching for his phone. We'll call the hospital. No, she said quickly. Just wait a second. Maybe I'm wrong. But she wasn't. She knew the patterns, had memorized the choreography of 3 lives turning beneath her skin like waves beneath moonlight. And tonight, there was only silence. They were in the car within 10 minutes. Ethan's hand locked tightly around hers. Neither of them spoke. The city outside passed in streaks of orange and blue, headlights bouncing off wet pavement. In the triage room, the nurse was kind but efficient. Cold gel, heart monitor, silence. Then a sudden rhythmic gallop. One, then another, then a third. All strong, all steady. Layla closed her eyes and cried, not out of fear, but out of the sheer, uncontainable relief of sound. Ethan leaned his forehead against her temple, his breath shaky. We're okay, he whispered. She turned her face into his shoulder and nodded. But something lingered. No doubt. Not trauma. Something quieter. Something sacred. A realization that everything they were building hung by the thinnest threads, and every moment of stillness, every hour of waiting, was a reminder that love didn't come with guarantees. It came with a choice, with presence, with the decision to stay, even when nothing made sense. They returned home just after dawn. Ethan helped her into bed and sat beside her until her breathing slowed and sleep returned. He didn't sleep. He walked to the nursery instead. The sun was rising over the city, casting long shadows across the wall where they'd hung watercolor prints of animals and stars. The room was ready, mostly. The cribs had yet to be assembled. The rocking chair still creaked slightly, but the shelves were lined with books. The drawers are full of blankets folded with reverence. He sat on the rug, surrounded by tiny clothes and unspoken hopes. And for the first time in a long while, he prayed. Not with words, not with doctrine, but with silence, with stillness, with the shape of his hand resting against the center of his chest, feeling for something that told him, yes, this is real, and yes, you are becoming the kind of man who stays. Autumn settled deeper into the edges of the city. The air took on a metallic chill, sharper than September, and the light shifted lower, warmer, as if the sun had grown more thoughtful. In the penthouse, the morning slowed. There were no alarms anymore, only the gentle rustling of sheets and the scent of ginger tea rising before either opened their eyes. Layla's pregnancy had begun to show in full now. Her movements grew more deliberate, and her silences became more frequent. Ethan noticed how she paused before walking up the 2 small steps into the bedroom. The way she winced slightly when sitting down. The way she placed her hands on her belly, now round and taut, and waited for movement like listening to a language only she could hear. He had begun measuring time differently, not by calendar invites or quarterly reports, but by minor signs. How many milliliters she drank, how many hours she rested, how often she sighed in her sleep. He kept a notebook tucked into the nightstand where he scribbled everything she mentioned in passing. Her craving for mangoes at midnight, the way the baby seemed to kick more when Nina Simone played, the fact that she couldn't stand the smell of fresh paint anymore. It was the most sacred data he'd ever collected. One Sunday afternoon, they visited a bookstore beneath a Capitol Hill cafe. It was the place with creaky floorboards and handwritten shelf markers, where the scent of old paper mingled with espresso and the occasional trace of cinnamon. Ethan had found a chair near the back. Layla moved slowly between shelves, one hand trailing along the spines like she was reading by touch. He watched her from a distance, letting the hush of the store wrap around them. She returned with a book in her hands, a worn copy of The House on Mango Street. She sat beside him, opened the cover, and ran her thumb over the first page. "My mom used to read this aloud when the power went out," she said. He looked at how her eyes lingered on the words, as if they still carried warmth. "Did she use voices?" Layla smiled. "Yes, all of them, even the old men." He laughed softly. "I'd like to hear your version someday. You just want me to read to the babies. Is it that obvious?" She rested her head on his shoulder, the book still in her lap. "They're going to grow up knowing stories, even if the lights never go out." Later that evening, while she napped in the living room, wrapped in his gray hoodie, Ethan stood before the nursery window, holding a list of names in his hand. They hadn't decided yet. The pressure to choose felt both premature and urgent. He whispered a few out loud. Some sounded like dreams, others like promises. Layla found him sitting on the floor with his back against the crib when she woke. Her hair was tousled, cheeks flushed from sleep, but her gaze was steady. "You're worried again," she said gently. "I'm thinking," he replied. "About?" "Names, finances, car seats, college funds, the statistical probability of all 3 being born on the same night." Layla chuckled as she approached, then lowered herself slowly beside him. "They won't care if we get it wrong sometimes." He turned to her. "What if I do?" "You will." "Thanks for the comfort." She smiled, then took his hand. "You'll get things wrong. So will I. But we'll also get things right. Like reading to them before bed, and remembering who hates the green pacifier, and knowing which cry means hungry and which one means tired." He nodded. "Being ready isn't about knowing everything," she said. "It's about showing up anyway." And he felt the words settle beneath his ribs, in a place he hadn't known was still listening. She. A few nights later, the hospital hosted a prenatal class. They had debated attending Ethan skeptical, Layla cautious, but eventually curiosity won out. The conference room was filled with couples in various stages of expectation. Some wide-eyed, some exhausted. One woman was already timing contractions on her smartwatch. They sat near the back, hands intertwined. The instructor was warm and expressive, walking them through breathing techniques and labor positions, even cracking jokes about epidurals and swollen ankles. but then she dimmed the lights and played a video reel delivery footage. The room went quiet. It wasn't graphic. It wasn't even long. But it was raw. A woman pushing through pain, her partner whispering encouragement, the sound of new life breaking into the world like a song half-remembered. Ethan didn't blink. When the lights came back on, he looked at Layla and found her watching him. Her eyes weren't afraid. They were full. "Still in?" she whispered. "More than ever." That night, they didn't talk. Not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said. They sat in bed, facing each other, knees touching beneath the covers. Layla had a hand resting lightly over the top of her belly, Ethan's fingers barely brushing the edge of hers. Then came the shift. Not dramatic, just a flutter, like a tiny wing tapping from within. Layla gasped softly. Her eyes widened. Ethan's heart stopped. "What was that?" he asked, barely breathing. She reached for his hand, guided it gently to the side of her abdomen. "Wait," she whispered. And then, a press. Subtle. Then again. 3 quick pulses. Ethan inhaled sharply. "They're saying hello," Layla said, her voice trembling with awe. He looked at her. And for the first time, I fully understood what it meant to fall in love with someone you hadn't yet met. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His tears said everything. The first snow came unexpectedly, drifting silently through the late November sky, like pieces of forgotten breath. It clung to street signs and pine needles, to cafe awnings and rooftops that hadn't expected to be blanketed so soon. The city looked suspended in a hush from the penthouse windows, as if even the skyline held something tender beneath its steel skin. Inside, everything had slowed. The days felt wrapped in gauze. Layla moved carefully now, the stretch of her belly unmistakable, her center of gravity tilted in a way that made ordinary things like rising from a chair or tying her hair require more patience than she liked to admit. She didn't complain, but Ethan noticed. He noticed the faint catch in her breath when she climbed out of bed, the way she paused at door frames to press a palm against her lower back, the subtle way her fingers curled around the edge of the kitchen counter when she thought he wasn't looking. So he made adjustments. He replaced the rugs with ones that wouldn't slip. He had a small bench installed beside the shower. He added a nightlight in the hallway, even though she told him it wasn't necessary. And when she shifted in her sleep, restlessly, without waking, he would turn the pillow behind her, brush the hair from her cheek, and rest his hand gently on the curve of her belly. Sometimes she mumbled words he couldn't quite understand. Sometimes they were names. Sometimes they were his. One afternoon, while Layla napped in the nursery rocking chair, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with her younger brother Malik. He had come up from Tacoma to help install the final crib. He looked barely older than 20, his hoodie oversized, his laughter easy. "She doesn't let people help," Malik said, cracking open a bottle of ginger soda. "You know that, right?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I do." "Even when she was a kid," Malik continued, "she'd carry groceries twice her size so my mom wouldn't have to. She thinks love is measured by how much you carry for other people." Ethan glanced toward the hallway. "She doesn't have to carry alone anymore." Malik studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you." Then, after a pause, "I think she does too." That night, snow thickened over the city. Traffic grew sluggish. The world outside glowed blue under the weight of clouds and light. Layla couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, wrapped in Ethan's robe, one hand curved gently around her belly. The city looked quieter than usual, like it had agreed to pause for a while. Ethan approached slowly. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" "I can't tell if they're quiet," she said, "or if I've just stopped noticing." "They've been moving," he assured her. "You were asleep earlier." You smiled and reached for your stomach. "They were rolling around like they were building a blanket fort there." She gave a small laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. She turned to him. "I didn't think I could do this. I didn't think my body would hold." He cupped her face, thumbs warm against her skin. "You're holding everything, and it's holding you back." She closed her eyes. "Sometimes I feel so small." Ethan leaned in. "You are, but you're carrying the whole world." The next day, the power flickered out. Not for long, an hour, maybe 2, but long enough for the heat to dip, for the lights to fade, for the silence to expand in places where music and murmurs usually lived. Layla sat on the couch under a blanket, holding a mug of warm water. The babies had kicked sharp, sudden little jabs all morning, making her shift every few minutes. Ethan crouched nearby, lighting candles one by one along the windowsill. "I used to love this," she said quietly. "Storms. When everything went dark, it made the house feel like a secret. Not anymore. It's different when you're the one who has to make sure the flashlights work." Ethan turned to her. "You don't have to be the only one anymore." She looked at him. Her expression was soft, but serious. "That still scares me sometimes." "What does?" "Being loved without needing to earn it." Ethan didn't reply right away. He sat beside her instead, took the mug from her hands and placed it on the coffee table. Then slowly, he leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. "You don't have to earn this," he said. "Not ever." "I know," she whispered, "but I still check the batteries, just in case." He smiled into the space between them. "Then we'll keep checking them together." Later, when the lights blinked back to life and the hum of the city returned in soft threads, appliances clicking on, heat rushing through vents, street lamps glowing back to full, Layla stood quietly in the nursery doorway, watching the 3 empty cribs. 3 spaces, 3 futures. She didn't cry. She breathed in the moment and felt its weight softly behind her ribs. Ethan came up behind her, resting both hands on her shoulders. "Have you picked a name?" she asked suddenly. "For which one?" "Any." He smiled. "I have ideas." "Me too." "Want to say one?" She hesitated. Then, "Amara." Ethan nodded slowly. "It means grace." "I know." He slipped his hand into hers. They didn't decide then, not formally, not aloud. But that name would be the first, not just because it was beautiful, but because it was soft, because it felt like her, because it was the name that rose first in Layla's mind every time she touched her belly and whispered to the stillness inside. And on nights when the city fell quiet under a fresh snowfall, the candles burned low and the wind curled like ribbon around the glass. That name was the one she said without speaking, and Ethan always heard it. The last stretch of December arrived with a deliberate stillness, like the hush of a stage right before the curtain rises. Even the air felt suspended, every snowflake descending with careful intention. Seattle had rarely seen this much snow in a single week. Schools closed, roads slowed, and the city, often blurred in rain, took on a new shape beneath the white. Inside their apartment, the days blurred gently into each other. The nursery was finally complete. not just furnished but lived in. Books lined the shelves with soft spines bent slightly at the corners from gentle readings aloud. A faint scent of lavender lingered from the linen sprays Ethan had chosen meticulously. The curtains fluttered faintly with each whisper of wind through the sealed windows. And 3 small cribs stood side by side, perfectly even, perfectly still. Each held a plush animal, waiting. And beneath the floorboards, beneath the quiet, there was movement. Inside Layla, life continued its quiet construction. It was just past midnight when Layla felt the first pain. She didn't cry out. She didn't gasp. It was more like a tightening, a quiet gathering in the base of her spine that rose and unfurled like a slow flame. She opened her eyes, one hand instinctively sliding to her belly. She waited, breathed, listened. 10 minutes passed before the next one came. Then another. Not sharp, not urgent, but steady, like a knock from within. Ethan stirred beside her. He always did, even before she moved, as though her silence had a weight his body could feel. "Hey," he murmured, voice heavy with sleep. She didn't smile. "They're starting," she said. His breath caught. "Now?" "I think so." He was up in seconds, reaching for the hospital bag near the door, his phone in hand, dialing the number they'd rehearsed. But Layla remained still, watching the ceiling. "I'm not ready," she whispered. Ethan paused, kneeling beside her, brushing a loose curl from her forehead. "You don't have to be. You have to go with them." She looked at him, and something inside her softened. "I'm scared." "So am I. But I thought you were the calm one," she said, a shaky laugh buried in her voice. He exhaled slowly. "Only when you're not scared." She took his hand and didn't let go. The car ride was hushed. Snow turned the streets into muffled corridors, and the tires hummed beneath them like a lullaby played too slowly. Layla didn't scream. She breathed, focused, counted. Ethan's hand remained firmly in hers, even as he drove with the other, when they hit a red light, and when her eyes fluttered closed against the weight of another contraction. In the hospital, time bent. Hours folded into hours. She was dilated, then not dilated enough, progressing, then stalling. She walked the hallway slowly, her fingers trailing the railing. She leaned into Ethan with every surge, his presence the only anchor she allowed. And when her strength began to fray at the edges, when her grip tightened around the cotton sheets, when her lips trembled with effort, she didn't cry. But Ethan did. Not because she was in pain, but because she was so firm, and yet so impossibly gentle with her fear. It was morning when the first child arrived, then the second. Then after a longer pause, one that made every nurse in the room hold their breath, the third. 3 small cries, 3 separate beginnings. Ethan stood frozen at first. Then I moved to the side, eyes wide, hands trembling. They were real. They were here. Layla, exhausted and pale, reached out for him. He came, bent low, placed his forehead against hers, and whispered, "You did it." She smiled weakly. "We did." And in that moment, with the hum of machines and soft voices in the background, nothing else existed except how her hand curled around his, how small it looked, how fierce it felt. Later, Ethan stood by the window when the babies were cleaned and swaddled, when the chaos had quieted and the room had emptied of all but soft sounds and breath. He was holding one of them, the nurse said Amara first. She was so small, so impossibly small. Her eyelids flickered, her fingers flexed, and beneath the soft blue cap, he could already see the delicate curve of her hairline, so much like Layla's. Behind him, Layla stirred in her bed. "You okay?" he asked without turning. "I think I'm dreaming." He smiled, eyes still on the snow-covered skyline. "Me too." She shifted, her voice growing softer. "Do you feel different?" He looked down at the bundle in his arms, then turned to her. "Yes," he said, like something broke open. "Your heart?" "No," he whispered, walking toward her. "My understanding of it." She watched as he carefully laid their daughter into the small bassinet beside her, then leaned over and kissed her temple. She closed her eyes, and finally slept. Not because she was no longer afraid, but because she didn't have to carry alone anymore. And just outside their window, the city exhaled. Snow continued to fall, and in one quiet corner of the world, love had arrived, not loud, not triumphant, but whole. The apartment changed after they came home, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that whispered through the walls, moved softly across the rugs, and lingered in the faint smell of milk and vanilla that now lived in the air. The once pristine spaces began to show signs of a new rhythm. Blankets draped unevenly on the armrest. Burp cloths folded over chairs. Pacifiers found in strange places, like behind a book or on the windowsill. It was no longer a showroom. It was a nest. Layla had become a mother in the span of 3 cries. But the more profound unfolding of that identity didn't arrive with hospital bracelets or birth certificates. It came in the quiet hours, those strange intervals between 2 a.m. and 5, when the house was asleep. But she was not. When one baby stirred, and then the next, and then the third, as if orchestrated by an invisible conductor with no regard for mercy. Her body ached in places she hadn't even known could ache. Her thoughts moved more slowly now, like they were moving through syrup. She sometimes forgot what day it was, whether she'd brushed her teeth, whether she'd finished that sentence, or only thought it. But still, she got up, each time, without complaint, without hesitation. Ethan was beside her, of course. He woke just as easily, learning each child's particular cry, how Micah's was sharp and indignant, how Amara's was a rising whimper, how Theo's came in short bursts like hiccups of frustration. He had developed a system for the bottle warmers and diapers that rivaled the efficiency of a logistics firm. But there were things only Layla could offer. The sound of her humming when one wouldn't settle, the way her voice slowed their tiny limbs, the way her skin calmed their breath. Sometimes, Ethan would pause in the hallway, watching her through a partially open door and not saying anything. Just witnessing. She moved through the darkness with a kind of weary grace, as if she'd made peace with the fact that sleep now belonged to another version of herself. One morning, after a night that left them both hollow-eyed and speechless, Layla stood in the nursery and stared at the window as the sun cracked over the horizon. Ethan came in quietly, a mug of tea in one hand, 2 bottles in the other. He set them down, and for a long moment, neither spoke. She looked at him, then looked, and said, "I don't know who I am anymore." He crossed the room, wrapped his arms around her from behind, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "You're someone who's allowed not to know right now," he murmured. Her throat tightened. She didn't cry, but she let her body lean wholly into his, and for the first time in days, she stopped moving. Later that week, Malik visited again. He brought groceries, held Theo for an hour, and made Ethan laugh so hard he nearly dropped a pacifier in the sink. Before leaving, he sat beside Layla on the couch, their feet tucked under the same quilt their mother had sewn when they were kids. "You're still in there," Malik said softly, noticing how she stared into the middle distance. "Even if it feels like you've disappeared." Layla pressed her lips together. "Everything feels like fog." "Fog clears," he said. "You're not lost. You're just under." She looked at him. "I want to be more than a body that doesn't sleep." He smiled. "You already are. But you're also allowed to be just that right now. That's sacred too." His words wrapped around her like balm. She hadn't even realized how tightly she held her breath until they settled. Chapter 2. That night, after the last baby had been fed, changed, and resettled, Layla walked into the living room to find Ethan sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by tiny socks and 3 baby monitors blinking like stars. She joined him. He handed her a sock. They folded in silence. Then Ethan asked, "Do you think we'll ever sleep again? Define sleep." He laughed. "Not just close your eyes sleep. I mean the kind where your body forgets what time it is, where you wake up and don't immediately count the minutes until the next cry." She looked at him. "Maybe, but I'm not sure I'd trade this." He tilted his head. "Even now?" "Even now." There was a pause. Then Ethan said, "I saw a photo of you last year. You were standing outside that art gallery in New Orleans. You were wearing red, and you looked untouched, like nothing had tried to wear you down." Layla's eyes softened. "I remember that day. You were stunning." I felt alone. He reached over, his fingers barely brushing hers. "You don't anymore?" She shook her head. "Tired?" he asked. She nodded, but not alone. And that, somehow, was enough. As January unfurled slowly over the city one morning, Layla sat with Amara nestled against her chest. The baby had just fallen asleep, breath soft and shallow, tiny fingers curled around the neckline of Layla's shirt. She didn't move, didn't dare. Instead, she stared at the window, where a single snowflake landed and lingered for a heartbeat before melting. She whispered, "You're my beginning." And though no one else heard it, she knew her daughter would always feel it. Hồi ChatGPT bạn đã nói, hãy bắt đầu viết phần 15 với độ dài khoảng 4.000 ký tự. Phong cách viết truyện ngôn tình, dùng từ ngữ khéo léo, tinh tế, thuyết phục khán giả. Cô chứa lời kêu gọi hành động ChatGPT đã nói. Part 15. The Quietest Miracle. It was a Thursday when the city turned gold. Late February sunlight streamed through the windows with an unhurried grace, pooling on the nursery floor like spilled honey. Outside, the sidewalks were damp from the morning thaw, and the bare trees stood like patient witnesses to something just about to begin. Inside the apartment, it was nap time. Amara slept on Layla's chest, Theo in the bassinet, and Micah curled against a cotton blanket patterned with little moons. The only sound was the faint rhythm of Layla's breathing and the low murmur of classical piano playing softly in the background Ethan's doing, a new habit he'd formed during feedings. Ethan stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, shirt wrinkled, his tie draped over the back of a chair. He wasn't working today. He hadn't worked in over a week, though he still checked emails, took brief calls, and stared far too long at spreadsheets he had no real energy for. But today, he'd made pancakes. They were slightly burnt at the edges, too thin, and shaped more like ovals than circles. But Layla had eaten them anyway, kissed his cheek, and told him they reminded her of her grandmother's sweet, imperfect, and full of effort. It was the first morning in weeks that she'd smiled without needing to. Later that day, they sat on the living room floor, Amara cradled in Ethan's arms, Theo nestled against Layla, and Micah snoring gently in a baby wrap across Ethan's chest. No one was speaking, not because there wasn't anything to say, but because some silences felt like blessings. Layla looked at Ethan, her eyes drawn to how his fingers curved instinctively to support their daughter's neck. How natural the gesture had become. "You're different," she said softly. He looked up, amused. "I haven't shaved in 4 days." "No," she said. "Not like that. You're quieter, like something settled in you." He thought for a moment, then nodded. "It did." She tilted her head. "What changed?" "I stopped trying to be perfect." Layla blinked. "I used to think love was something you earned through competence," Ethan continued. "Like if I got the schedule right, if I held them just so, if I memorized every symptom and feeding cue, then I'd be worthy of them. And now? Now I know love isn't about precision. It's about presence." Layla's breath caught, and for a long time, neither of them looked away. That evening, Malik stopped by with a meal he'd cooked himself, vegetarian stew with sweet potatoes and coriander. He held each of the babies, let them drool on his hoodie, and told Ethan he was becoming soft in the best possible way. After Malik left, the apartment felt strangely larger, quieter, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. Layla walked to the window, cradling Theo against her shoulder. The streetlights had flickered on, casting amber halos onto the pavement. Far below, a couple walked by with matching red scarves, laughing about something too far to hear. Ethan approached, one arm wrapped around her waist, chin resting against her hair. "We're doing this," she said quietly. He nodded. "We are." And just then, Theo stirred. Layla rocked him gently, humming something half-remembered from childhood, something her mother used to sing when the night felt too heavy. "Do you think they'll remember any of this?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "No, but we will." She turned to him. "That has to be enough, right? It's everything." In the weeks that followed, the weather began to warm. The babies grew fast, cheeks fuller, limbs firmer, eyes more curious. Each day brought something new, a smile that lingered longer than before, a coo that sounded suspiciously like a word. The first time one of them grasped Ethan's finger and didn't let go. Layla found herself laughing again, not the kind of laughter that's polite or practiced, but the kind that surprises even her. The kind that starts in the throat and shakes something loose in the ribs. One morning, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and paused. There were dark circles beneath her eyes. Her hair was tied in a loose, uneven bun. She was wearing Ethan's sweatshirt, and a faint smudge of banana puree was on her shoulder. But she didn't look tired. She looked alive. And for the first time since the hospital, she whispered to herself, "I'm still here." One evening, with all 3 babies finally asleep, Ethan brought out a small box. Layla raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Something I've been waiting to give you." He opened it carefully. Inside was a delicate necklace, 3 tiny gold rings interlocked on a fine chain. Layla stared. "It's beautiful," she murmured, running her fingers across the rings. "One for each heartbeat," Ethan said, "and all of them tied to you." She didn't speak for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "You always know exactly what to say." He shrugged. I've had a lot of practice lately. She laughed, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could catch it. Then she leaned forward and kissed him slowly, sincerely, like she thanked him for the gift and for staying, for learning her silence, for making space. And in that moment, with the city wrapped in twilight and the world hushed beneath the weight of evening, they weren't just parents. They were people. Two people had chosen to build a life, not in grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but in the most minor things. A midnight feeding, a shared smile, a name whispered into a newborn's ear. And somewhere, deep within those quiet, ordinary hours, a miracle had happened. The first spring breeze arrived, like a forgotten song, familiar, faint, and wrapped in the smell of wet earth and blooming jasmine. It crept through the barely cracked windows of the apartment, curling softly around the edges of curtains, brushing against Layla's ankles as she stood barefoot in the nursery, sunlight streaking across the floor in golden threads. The babies had just fallen asleep. Micah, with one arm flung dramatically over his face like a tiny opera star in repose. Amara curled into herself with perfect stillness, as if memorizing the shape of peace. And Theo, her night owl, gripped the edge of his blanket like he was ready for adventure, even in dreams. She watched them, not as a woman undone by exhaustion, not as a body made of milk and lullabies, but as their mother, fully, finally, quietly. Ethan entered without a sound, carrying a glass of iced tea and a folded blanket. He didn't speak. He watched her for a moment, how her hands rested on her belly out of habit, and her eyes softened with something unspoken. "They're changing," he whispered. She nodded. "Every day." "And you," he added, "are still the center of everything." She smiled, not out of reflex, but because it felt honest. "I don't know who I would have been if they hadn't happened," she said quietly. "I do," Ethan replied. "You would have still been the woman who saved me." She turned to face him fully. "You say that like it's a fact." "It is," he said, crossing the room to take her hand. "You just didn't know it yet." That afternoon, they took the babies to the rooftop garden. The air smelled of hyacinth and the faint salt of the bay in the distance. Birds looped through the sky in lazy spirals, and across the city, the skyline shimmered with the slow heat of spring beginning its long conversation with the earth. They laid out a blanket, bought 3 small rattles, a thermos of coffee, a sun hat too big for Theo, but worn anyway, because it made everyone laugh. Ethan watched Layla tilt her face toward the sun, her eyes closed, her braids catching the wind. She looked like someone who had walked through a storm and finally recognized the stillness on the other side as hers. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked suddenly. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. "I regret not believing it sooner," she said. "That joy could be real, that it could be this quiet and still matter." He nodded slowly. Then they glanced down at their children, all 3 squinting toward the light, reaching toward nothing and everything with open hands. "We should write it down," he said. "What?" "All of it. Every strange, beautiful, unbearable piece of this." "Why?" "So they'll know who they came from, and who we became when we met them." Layla smiled, shifting closer until her shoulder touched his. "Then let's begin." Months passed. Their apartment was filled with laughter, toys, and the music of ordinary chaos. There were tantrums, first words, sleepless nights, and days that felt impossibly long. But there were also quiet triumphs. Amara's first step between them, Micah learning to hum when Layla did, Theo saying Dada, and then Mama, within the same breath. Ethan took more time off work. Layla returned to painting, slowly, carefully color by color, hour by hour, until one canvas became two. Her art shifted. Less precision, more story. Less control, more feeling. And in one of her gallery shows, a critic would later write that each stroke felt like a memory remembered not by the mind, but by the heart. When strangers asked how they managed 3 children, or how they looked so at ease, they never answered with anything clever or performative. They just looked at each other and knew the honest answer didn't need to be spoken. On the twins' first birthday, the apartment was filled with people, family, friends, neighbors who had once been strangers but now brought over casseroles and offered to babysit without asking why. Malik gave a speech that made everyone laugh and then tear up. Ethan's father, who hadn't visited in years, arrived with handmade wooden toys and shaky hands. Layla's old art professor stopped by to say she was proud. But the moment that stayed with Layla came after the party ended. After the candles were blown out and the guests trickled away. When the babies were asleep, the floor was sticky with frosting, and Ethan had fallen onto the couch, eyes half closed. Layla stood in the center of the room, holding one of the birthday cards someone had left behind. On the front, it read, "Love is not made loud. It's made every day." She closed her eyes and felt it, not just around her, but within her, in her bones, in her breath, in the memory of that hospital hallway, the long nights, and the mornings filled with nothing but crying and the smell of oatmeal. Love wasn't perfect. It was present, and that made all the difference. If you followed this story from the beginning, thank you. Not just for watching, but for believing in quiet miracles, in second chances, in the strength of a woman's silence, and the way a man can learn softness without losing himself. And if you've ever felt like joy wasn't meant for you, maybe you've been building it all along. If this story touched your heart, feel free to like, comment on your favorite moment, or follow for more beautiful journeys. Because love is happening, everywhere, sometimes loudly, but more often, like this.